Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel.
Merci, M. le Président. J'aimerais demander à la ministre responsable pour la condition féminine au Canada si elle serait prête à dire qu'il nous faut une stratégie nationale d'action pour prévenir et mettre fin à la violence contre les femmes. On parle aujourd'hui d'un enjeu qui est vraiment la violence contre les femmes. Pourquoi est-ce que ce gouvernement est en train d'isoler une communauté et de dire que c'est différent, que c'est culturel, alors qu'on parle en général de violence faite aux femmes, qu'il faut adresser en totalité et pas nécessairement différemment, de façon appropriée culturellement pour les différents groupes, pour les femmes autochtones, pour les nouveaux arrivants, mais qui doit être adressé pour tout le monde, à la place de mettre de l'avant un projet de loi qui est essentiellement raciste.
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the member opposite for her question. The government has actually taken action in a number of areas that deal with eliminating violence against women and girls. And I guess the thing I find most concerning is that we'll put forward initiatives and the opposition simply say no. Whether that be our action plan to support Aboriginal women and girls, these victims of crime, whether it be our national action plan against human trafficking, which obviously substantially impacts women. We've put forward initiatives to eliminate and focus on decreasing cyber violence and cyber bullying. That's something that we know disproportionately impacts young women. But all of these things the opposition vote against. So I guess my question for the member opposite would be, we're moving forward with action to make sure that these victims of crime are both supported, we prevent crime, and that those that conduct these heinous acts are actually put behind bars. I wonder why the members opposite never seem to understand that they should support these initiatives to protect women from these violent offenders.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire, l'honorable député d'Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel.
I would follow up by asking the minister whether she realizes that this bill is actually further marginalizing women whose family members have put them in this situation of violence and are therefore not able to bring forward criminal charges and often don't want to. They need the resources and the tools available to them, and these rather than simply changing the law and saying we're going after this problem in isolation when we're just going to further drive these women underground.
Honourable Minister.
I have to say that I'm surprised by this comment. Women and girls deserve to be protected, and our government supports, in fact, as I mentioned in my speech, if the member had been listening, 720 projects since 2007 that focus particularly on eliminating violence against women and girls. Our government is focused on action to support these victims of crime, to make sure that those individuals that have experienced these horrendous acts. I don't know if the member opposite has met many of these women. I have met them in the emergency department when they have been beaten and when they have been harmed. I would encourage her, step up, support these women, support what our government is doing, because we are going to protect these victims, we're going to support them and support their families.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable député d'Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Il m'a fait plaisir de prendre la parole sur ce débat, évidemment parce que c'est quelque chose qui me touche vraiment. Je suis vraiment inquiète du problème de la violence faite contre toutes les femmes au Canada. C'est mon premier discours en tant que la porte-parole du NPD pour la condition féminine et je crois que c'est un enjeu sur lequel il est très d'actualité pour que je commence à parler parce qu'on parle vraiment directement de la violence contre les femmes. Et c'est l'enjeu qui est le plus important actuellement pour les femmes au Canada et autour du monde. Il y a tellement de travail qui reste à faire pour qu'on puisse arriver à l'égalité. Et une des premières choses qu'il faut faire, c'est de mettre fin à cette violence pour toutes les femmes. Et c'est vraiment important qu'on le fasse de façon holistique, qu'on le fait en reconnaissant que c'est l'inégalité sociétale contre toutes les femmes qui est en train de causer cette violence. Let's start, though, by speaking about and understanding what forced marriage is in Canada, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to read some of the great work done on the issue of violence against women in the form of forced or non-consensual marriage as part of my speech, because I think it gives us a good idea of what it is to live a forced marriage. This is from the report on the practice of forced marriage in Canada, interviews with frontliners prepared by Nema Bendris, presented to the Department of Justice Canada in November 2008. So I'm quoting. Although contrary to the law and an infringement of human rights under international law, forced marriage is most often the repetition of a cultural practice and a significant part of matrimonial traditions in families which practice it. A marriage is regarded as forced when the people who bring it about are not concerned about the consent of the individuals involved and put pressure on them in order to achieve their goal. Violence is always present, whether verbal, psychological, or physical, and mainly targets young women. Because it is taboo, this practice is still greatly underestimated, if not completely ignored in Canadian society, and victims keep it a secret, so as not to bring public disgrace to their families. The secrecy is heightened by the fact that the situation occurs in private. Women who are in a position of dependency in a relationship of subordination with their husbands because they have been sponsored by them. This situation can hinder women's independence and strengthen the spouse's hold over them, and thereby create an unequal relationship. This is the case with many women who met our respondents, who were married against their will and sponsored by their spouse, and who, in addition, are victims of conjugal violence, making their lives a series of painful events that can leave them increasingly vulnerable. Because they are vulnerable, because they are in a dependent situation precisely as a result of their status as a sponsored family member, which ties them to their husbands and can be used by the husbands for all sorts of blackmail threats and humiliation. So we're looking at the problem of Bill S-7 in that it's really further chipping away women's opportunities at these women's opportunities. We're greatly exacerbating the problem, in other words, essentially, by bringing forward this legislation. And I want to talk about why, and why the government needs to understand the issue better. It happens way too often that we sort of throw legislation at things, at a problem, say, you know, okay, well, we've changed the rules, this is now under the criminal code, this is now illegal, and therefore the problem is solved. In this particular case, there are already criminal code routes to go about, and it isn't as though you can't be prosecuted for beating your wife just because it happens to be something that is a quote-unquote honor killing or something, or because of it was a case of forced marriage. Those are still prosecutable crimes. It doesn't change based on where you come from. So that's something to keep in mind. But I wonder whether this is really what this is about, because, I mean, we've seen recently comments by the Prime Minister even singling out niqab wearing women and antagonizing them, which is really simply a way of dividing people and singling people out and creating a national debate around something that really shouldn't be, when we really should be working on empowering rather than antagonizing and creating an us and them narrative. This us and them mentality is this idea that violence against women is barbaric in some cultures is simply unfortunate because it seems to say that if it isn't part of this cultural community or part of coming from people who are new immigrants, then it's simply, you know, some bad choice, or, you know, not something that's seen as systemic or societal, and that's something that I cannot support. I think it is incredibly important to make sure we're looking at all forms of violence against women, no matter what community you come from. Les spécialistes qui se sont présentés devant le comité du Sénat qui ont regardé S-7, ils ont expliqué que la criminalisation ne va pas suffire pour régler le problème et qu'elle aura l'effet, en fait, au contraire, d'exacerber le problème. Alors que les survivantes et les victimes, comme j'ai mentionné tout à l'heure, choisissent rarement de poursuivre dans les cas de mariage forcé, il y a actuellement plusieurs dispositions du Code criminel qui offrent déjà une voie de recours à l'égard des infractions visées par ce projet de loi. Au lieu de politiser la question de la violence fondée sur le sexe, le gouvernement devrait et pourrait, mais devrait renforcer les mesures législatives qui sont déjà en place et s'investir vraiment dans les organismes de services qui sont sur le terrain. Ça, c'est où le travail se fait pour de vrai. Il faudrait aussi, et vraiment ça c'est ce que je crois sincèrement, ça serait de mettre en place un plan d'action nationale pour mettre fin à la violence contre les femmes, parce que la violence existe dans toutes les communautés. Mais dans ce projet de loi, le titre abrégé est sincèrement xénophobe. Ça s'appelle la loi sur la tolérance zéro face aux pratiques culturelles et barbares, ce qui est ce qui vise vraiment d'isoler une communauté et de dire qu'ils sont barbares à cause de la violence contre les femmes. On doit dire que la violence contre les femmes, c'est un problème qui existe partout pour toutes les femmes. Et donc, ce n'est pas logique de dire ça contre une communauté en particulier. C'est un problème que nous vivons tous. C'est un problème extrêmement sérieux que nous devons tous prendre au sérieux et prendre à cœur et faire tout ce qu'on peut pour y mettre fin. Mais d'isoler une communauté puis de dire ça, c'est vraiment, comme je disais tout à l'heure, c'est raciste. Ça renforce les préjugés contre certains groupes culturels parce que ça les cible. Donc, il faut plutôt s'attaquer aux problèmes en totalité plutôt que de marginaliser ces femmes. As I said, current legislation sufficiently addresses the issue. Civil and common provincial laws require marriage to be entered in with free and enlightened legal consent. Canadian criminal law provides recourses relevant in most cases involving force, minors, threats, abduction, confinement, sexual offenses, etc. Further, Canada is a signatory to multiple international treaties, including CEDAW, which is the Committee for the Ending Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So these are already things that we are doing. Of course, we need to reinforce these things. How do we reinforce? That means we need to be helping the shelters, helping organizations that are working with communities and working with women on the ground. That's how we do that. We give tools to law enforcement. We give tools like legal aid. Those are and we give, of course, mental health and health services as well. But simply going about it in terms of having a law that specifically targets one community is just completely, it's a one-track sort of way of doing it, and it's not looking at the whole problem in totality. Further, criminalization will prevent individuals from seeking help. It will marginalize the women. Over and over, we've heard frontline workers hear from women and girls saying that I don't want protection from police, I don't want to prosecute my parents, my family, I don't want to see them go to jail. So that we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep what they're asking of us in mind. We need to listen to these women. They can withdraw charges rather than see, they will often withdraw charges rather than see someone in their family prosecuted. So it's a very difficult situation. I completely acknowledge that, but we do need to be working with them and recognize that where there is the desire to prosecute, those laws are there. And if there is not a desire, then we still need to find a way to be intervening, and that's why a national strategy is very important. They may often also be financially or otherwise dependent on the person that is oppressing and being violent towards them. They may be afraid of the repercussions of revenge of other family members or something like that, or other people in the community. Victims have reported that being forced to break up family ties forever can lead to rejection, stigma, ostracization, and a sense of shame and dishonor and depression. So these are all things that we need to be keeping in mind. I want to quote from the Senate hearings Dr. Hannah Siddiqui. She's the head of policy and research in the United Kingdom. There's a women's minority organization called Southall Black Sisters, and they work on the needs specifically of black and minority women who are facing gender-based violence in the UK. So I'd like to quote from her testimony. She says, quote, "We obviously wanted to condemn forced marriage as a practice within communities, but we disagreed on the need to criminalize it. The problem for us was that we worked directly with survivors and victims. A lot of them are girls and young women who say to us, I don't want protection from police, but I don't want to prosecute my parents and family. I don't want to see them go to jail. They clearly said that if they went to the police and they were going to prosecute, then they would withdraw their charges. I think the concern was that the whole problem of forced marriage would be driven underground, particularly at a time when we were trying to encourage victims to come forward. The other thing victims said was that if you criminalize it, then it may mean that they have to break up family ties. So that's very important to keep in mind, that this is someone who has been through the legislative process in the United Kingdom, saying that this is exactly what was happening in this debate. So furthermore, this legislation is inherently racist, as I said, treating violence towards immigration women specifically as somehow barbaric, or more barbaric, that is, than any other kind of gender-based violence, which is simply ridiculous, because all violence should be considered unacceptable, and so therefore specifying particularly is really just adding a racist dimension to it. It makes it a cultural problem rather than a gendered one, which is what it really is, and therefore making us forget that we need to be tackling it in all communities. It's also important that I raise a quote from actually FIWO committee, Status of Women Committee. Just 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Deepa Matu with us, and she said she wanted to point out, so I'll quote, "It's not only marginalizing women, it's also marginalizing the communities they come from and targeting certain communities more so. I think it takes us away from the discourse and the reality that violence against women happens across cultures and across people's historical backgrounds, more so when there has been a history of colonization and there has been a history of marginalization of other kinds. So not considering violence against women a holistic issue and coming up with discourse around that, there is some kind of barbaric culture in certain communities. New immigrants are necessarily more violent than people living here in Canada. I think that's very problematic." So as I mentioned as well, it also drives people further underground because they don't know what to do. They can't come forward and prosecute because they don't have the resources in the community and the services to help them. The only option that they have is to send a family member to jail, which will result in a community, can result in very difficult situation for them within the community. It's politicizing the issue, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. Like I said, it's this us and them mentality. This is a cultural problem. It's not a gendered problem. It's not something that we all need to be addressing. It's specific to this community. So that's something that's very, very problematic as well. And it's also important to mention that it doesn't work or consult with stakeholders. It didn't listen to women, to survivors. It doesn't listen to their stories. And that, I think, is also incredibly important to point out. So while this bill is purporting to protect and support vulnerable individuals, and arguing that these practices exist, as a result of immigration, and saying that the government is committed to ending that, it's really a problem that is gendered. And this is what I want to talk about with some of the time that I have left here. Let's talk about violence against women. Violence against women happens all across Canada, all around the world. The United Nations defines violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. And that can include, and I mean, this is very serious stuff that we're talking about. Physical abuse, so slapping, choking, punching, using hands, objects as weapons, threatening with a gun, a knife, committing murder, that is physical abuse. Sexual abuse, using threats, intimidation, or physical force to force women into unwanted sexual acts. Emotional and verbal abuse, threatening to kill, whether it be the woman, her children, her loved ones, her pets, threatening to commit suicide, making humiliating or degrading comments about her body or her behavior, forcing her to commit degrading acts, isolating her from friends or family, confining her to the house, destroying her possessions, and other actions designed to demean or restrict her freedom and independence. There's financial abuse, stealing or controlling her money or valuables. This is particularly a problem with regards to older women. Forcing her to work, denying her the right to work are also included in this. There's also spiritual abuse, so using religious or spiritual beliefs to manipulate, dominate, or control. Criminal harassment and stalking is considered violence against women, following, watching in a persistent, malicious, unwanted manner. An unwanted manner, I think, is an important thing to underline here. Invading privacy in a way that threatens personal safety. There are so many ways in which violence against women exists in our society. And who is affected, Mr. Speaker? All women. Young women, elderly women, working women, mothers, teachers, our sex workers, CEOs, members of parliament, Indigenous women particularly, and immigrant women particularly as well, because they're facing these double whammies of racism and sexism. And that is why when you're looking at an intersectioning violence problem, we need to be doing it in a lens that is all-encompassing towards ending violence against women, because it happens as much to women in Toronto as it does in rural Saskatchewan. So we really, really need to be looking at it holistically. So here's what we need to be doing. And I want to bring back Deepa Matu and cite her one more time. She says that when they started to work on the issue, quote, "One thing that we have been clear about is that it is part of a continuum of violence against women and nothing else. It should be dealt with within that same framework. We are never wanting it to be dealt with any differently. Again, we wanted the systems to be sensitive and alive to the issue of distinct experiences of women who face this form of violence, but we wanted it to be included in the violence against women framework. But unfortunately, it has been somehow discussed in a way, as we know, with Bill S-7 that is on the table right now. There is an assumption that is coming that somehow the current legal system does not have enough in it to address the issue, whereas our education from clients, the survivors, and our education from the communities very much tell us that the existing systems and structures are enough to serve the needs of the population if they want to access the law and justice in that way. Unfortunately, I think we haven't learned enough from what we see. The women don't necessarily want to report. So what we need is to support those communities. We need legal aid. We need to listen to the women that are coming forward. We need to consult our stakeholders who are able to list recommendations of specifically what needs to be done. And that includes supporting women when they do immigrate to Canada. But that means really making sure that we're making sure economically, socially, and civically and politically, women are equal, all of us. And that means structurally and helping out the organizations on the ground and really listening to the women. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Way to go.
Excuse me. Questions and comments, Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism and Citizenship.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the very confusing speech. Clearly the member is confused about the legislation. Doubtful if she read the legislation, if she did, whether she understood the purpose of the legislation. To make a suggestion that there's some correlation between barbaric cultural practice and somehow tying that into a targeted cultural community is bizarre and absurd. And to also suggest, Mr. Speaker, in this House, in this sacred place, that a piece of legislation that two of the parties are supporting, the government is supporting and the third party is supporting, is racist, is way beyond the pale and crosses the line. The member also said that we should be listening to people across the country. Well, we are, Mr. Speaker, so my question to her is simply this. What does she have to say to Aruna Pak from the National Post on November 3rd, 2014, who stated this: forced into an abusive marriage at 17 and unable to leave it for 18 years. I can attest to the fact that forced marriage is effectively a life of slavery. I congratulate the Canadian government for taking a bold step on behalf of women who have nowhere to turn for help. I would hope that the member would retract some of the shameful words that she used in her dissertation earlier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Deputy d'Argenteuil Papineau Mirabel.
I am very offended by the fact that the member suggested that I hadn't read the legislation or didn't know what I was talking about, and would point to a continued sexism that exists in this House. I really think he misunderstands. Perhaps he wasn't listening to my speech. I did go into French at some point, so I'm not sure if he followed me the entire way. What I'm saying is that currently, in the way that he has brought forward this issue, even just evidenced in that comment that he made, he's creating this us and them mentality. This is a cultural issue. This is a problem that exists here. And that is really racist, because we know that violence against women exists everywhere. And that doesn't mean that just because you belong to a community, you are violent towards women. And that is why what they're doing right now is problematic, Mr. Speaker. It's very important that we actually listen to what the women want us to be doing. There are currently criminal ways of prosecuting when these things happen, but we really need to be figuring out how not to marginalize. And one of the things we can be doing is by having better protection for permanent residents and persons without status. That's something very concrete that we could be doing that we're not. And instead, we're trying to marginalize these women by saying the only option for them is to prosecute. I'm not saying that what they're living isn't horrifying. All violence against women is horrifying. We need to address all of it.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député d'Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais savoir si ma collègue considère que c'est un peu irresponsable comme attitude de, d'un côté, de criminaliser tous ces gestes-là, mais sans se soucier des conséquences potentielles pour les femmes sur leur vie et sans avoir de plan pour minimiser ces conséquences potentielles-là et leur permettre de, si on peut dire, passer au travers de cette épreuve-là et de continuer à être intégrés dans la communauté. Donc, est-ce qu'on devrait se soucier davantage des suites de la criminalisation des actes dont elles ont été victimes? Et est-ce que le gouvernement aurait dû présenter en même temps un plan pour éviter ces conséquences potentielles-là, en même temps que présenter les actions juridiques qui criminalisent davantage?
L'honorable député d'Argenteuil Papineau Mirabel.
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be, like I said, I've said it several times, there needs to be a national action plan to address violence against all women. We need that. And do you know what that includes? That would include, number one, actually consulting with these women, all women, and understanding what the problem is. And part of understanding what the problem is actually having accurate data and accurate research. And that's a really important thing that we're currently missing with this government because they don't fund that kind of research. But really importantly, too, we need safe and affordable housing. We need to be helping out the shelters that are doing the work on the ground. And certainly we can cite specific funds sent to certain specific shelters, and that's good that we're helping, but we're nowhere near helping as much as we should be. We really need to make it part of a national strategy to address this problem, because shelters are where women go to get services, to get help, to get out of a situation, and that's the front line, and that's where we need to be putting our effort. And it's really important, like I was saying, to remember that it's not just it's not just by doing those kinds of things that we're going to be by doing criminal law changes, or that we're going to be addressing this issue. We need to be really giving the women way out. I'm going to quote very quickly Deepa Matu again. Women are often threatened with deportation by abusers. The system is built in a way that they can actually face the consequences of that violence. They will be deported, irrespective of whether they are report it or not. They can face the consequences of getting deported because they were violated or they chose to report abuse. So maybe we need to be addressing this issue rather than simply criminalizing further.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the audacity of a member of Parliament to stand in this House and suggest that a question arising from her presentation is somehow sexism in the House is unbelievable, truly unbelievable. Permettez-moi, Monsieur le Président, de citer Julie Méville-Deschênes, présidente du Conseil du statut de la femme dans le Journal de Montréal le 6 novembre 2014. Ça va permettre de contrer le phénomène de petites filles qui sont envoyées à l'étranger pendant leurs vacances pour les forcer à se marier. Qu'est-ce que le membre avoir à dire, veut dire à Madame Méville-Deschênes? Je veux savoir. Merci.
L'honorable député d'Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel.
Truly, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that the member is understanding me. I'm not saying that what women are living is not completely. It breaks my heart, seriously, to understand that women across this country and around the world face incredible violence. I can't believe that the member doesn't see that I feel that way about it. What I'm saying is that when women are faced with this situation, they can prosecute. Those laws are there. I mean, wouldn't it be ridiculous if in Canada you couldn't prosecute because you were living in a situation of violence? We, however, know that very, very few women report any kind of violence, let alone make it through the complicated and cumbersome legal system to actually see a conviction. So what we need to be doing is getting services and getting support. Those are the things that we need to be doing. So I don't understand why the member is accusing me of not understanding that. I do see these things myself. I know women who have been beaten, who have been murdered in my life, and it's very, very important that we address that for all women. And we need specific culturally appropriate things that are helpful, services, housing, shelters, etc., and across Canada. But this is something that all of us as women are facing, and to isolate it as he is doing is, as I said earlier, simply racist.